Yeah. My name is Ulrich Obrist. I'm the artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London, and we are here in Bellagio.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me ask a broad question, which is, democracy is, of course, not just a political system, but a set of values. And the artistic community has a very important role to play in that, historically and now. So, could I have you speak of what role does the artistic community play in democracy, not only in your own country, but around the world?
Yeah, I think it's indeed very important that we discuss art in the political process and that we bring artists to the table of discussions. I think it's important. John Latham and Barbara Stevini in the 1960s came up with this wonderful idea of APG, and APG stands for Artist Placement Group. And the idea was to basically have artists within government, artists in residence in government, but also in every major corporation, in every major company, there would be an artist in residence. And it's interesting because if you go back to Marshall McLuhan, he in the 60s said, artists have these radars. Very often artists anticipate things which later on become relevant in society. So it's, I think important to not just show art in museums, in galleries, in biennales, in exhibitions, but to involve artists very actively in this process, exactly as Latham and Stevini have so presciently suggested. I think it's interesting also at this very moment, of course, in the 21st century, there seems to be a big doubt about many institutions, but of course, institutions, let me start that again. Maybe you should ask a question because I've answered your first question. Yeah.
No, so you were saying, but I can ask again.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask also, because you were speaking about the role of artists and institutions, but artists play an important role in social movements historically and now. So when you think of the role of art in social movements, how has that changed over the past, and how do you see that now?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that very often also artists invent institutions. Artists are at the origin, of institutions. If we think about Edouard Glissant, who is for me somehow at the core of the theme here discussed in Bellagio. I think he's an extraordinary toolbox for the 21st century. The late Edouard Glissant, the writer and poet from Martinique, who lived in Paris at the end of his life, and he early on, understood that we live in a world of extreme globalization. It's of course not the first time that the world experiences globalization, but it's certainly the most extreme moment of globalization and fueled by technology. There is a very violent dimension to it, and that of course means that a lot of things are eroded, a lot of things disappear through that process of homogenized globalization. Gustav Metzger, the late Gustav Metzger, another prescient artist, always said how important it really is to address that theme of extinction, because we live in an age of mass extinction. Elizabeth Kolber calls it the sixth mass extinction. Gustav Metzger says it's not only species which disappear en masse, but it's also a lot of cultural phenomena disappear, like languages. Susan Hiller made an entire film where she shows the extinction of languages, the disappearance of languages, and I of course devote my entire Instagram and social media project to this idea of saving handwriting, because in my last conversation with Umberto Eco, where he expressed big concerns about the disappearance of calligraphy and handwriting, we decided to actually make that the theme of my Instagram, which we then started with the poet Etel Adnan. And so every day, I post a handwritten note, a handwritten doodle, a sketch, on Instagram to basically, contribute hopefully to this idea of saving handwriting, saving doodling, and give it a kind of a new presence. So I think it's interesting, this, idea, to come back to Glissant. So we live in an age of extreme globalization. Homogenizing forces are at stake, lead in many different ways to extinction. But we also live in an age where the counter-reaction, and Glissant anticipated that very early on, already in the 60s, he saw it come, that actually the counter-reaction to this extreme form of globalization might be as dangerous and as destructive, and would lead to new forms of, isolationism. It would lead to new forms of isolationism. It would lead to new forms of lack of tolerance, to new forms of racism. And in a way, of course, this needs to be vehemently resisted. So he said, we have to resist the homogenized form of globalization. We have to resist this isolationist, nationalist, counter-reaction to globalization. We have to kind of find something which he called mondialité. And there isn't really a word in English for that. Mondialité, it would be maybe something like mondiality. It's a kind of a global, dialogue which is respectful of local differences, a global dialogue which is also willing to listen, which embraces, of course, the potential we have today with technology, in this global world to talk to each other. And Glissant says, that's so important because he says the archipelago is the model. And I think that's an interesting thing also in terms of, democracy, because Glissant said that continents are often, homogenizing, whilst the archipelago, and he came from Martinique, so of course he thought not only of it in terms of a metaphor, but also very real in terms of the islands, surrounding Martinique. And he said it's in this exchange with these other islands that the identity becomes richer. It's the creolization of language, and it's not because he has an exchange with all these other islands that his identity dilutes or disappears. And I think that as a message, for all kinds of processes of society today is so important. Mondialité as a kind of a toolbox.
That's wonderful. And, thinking about this kind of technological globalization wave we're experiencing, on the negative, obviously, all these instances of extinction, but it also provides a lot of opportunity. So how do you think about how you can seize the opportunity, whether it's for cultural exchange or economic development or whatever the case is, while preserving all these things from the past that are important, culture, handwriting, democracy? How do we think through that evolution of adaptation without losing what's important?
Yeah, Panofsky said the future is often, invented with fragments from the past. So I don't think it's about being nostalgic. It's not about, looking back in a nostalgic way, but it's about, saving things, not losing them, and basically making them into a toolbox to build the future, right? And I think also one thing which I think is very relevant in in this whole discussion is the aspect also that of la longue durée, when Fernand Braudel talks about the long durational aspect. And I think particularly this idea of institutions very often of course leads to the question what is a long durational contract, what is a social contract also for our time. And I think in a way we live in a moment of immediatism, of very often transactional immediatism or immediate transactionalism, however we call it. And I think in that context it's important to think about the 22nd century. We shouldn't already assume that extinction is going to happen, because I think it's quite worrisome that we live now already in the later part. We already live in the latter part of the second decade of the 21st century. And there are very few visions and thoughts about what that 22nd century could be, which is why actually for a project we did in China, the Shanghai project, we focused very much on this idea of what are visions, for a longer term future, what are visions of artists for the 22nd century.
So speaking of the 22nd century, what's your vision for democracy 80 years from now, and how do we get there?
I think another conundrum is, of course, also this idea of making, institutions and making processes more participatory. And I think this idea of participation is a key possibility, we have in the digital age. But at the same time, I think it's important that does not create the polarization to this idea of the expert, because I think, as Umberto Eco pointed out, whenever there is a call for the disappearance of the expert, that's a sign of fascism. That's very dangerous, And I think it's important that we can have both. We can have, experts and at the same time also processes where actually everybody can, participate. The two things should not be polarized, should not be, mutually exclusive, something like that.
And speaking of artists, often, certainly in the case of my own country, but the artistic community is often accused of being elite or disconnected from people. Of course, it's not the case, but you know, how can art integrate itself, you know, outside the galleries in the streets with the average people? What does the role have? The role that art can play on that level of democratic development?
I think it's very important, you know, if we think with Etelatnan about this idea, you know, about love and solidarity, you know, and dialogue and not isolation. I think art, as Etelatnan says, can make a very major contribution to that. In a more polarized world, you know, art can, in a way, you know, build many bridges. But I think one thing which is important is Tim Berners-Lee, you know, Tim Berners-Lee founded the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee founded the World Wide Web. We can say Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. It's better. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web in 1989, and of course started with this idea of net neutrality, as he famously always says. You know, this is for everyone, and we very much believe at the Serpentine in that idea also for art. You know, we have free admission, and a couple of months ago, a taxi driver, you know, dropped me. I came back from a trip very early one morning in Kensington Gardens, and you know, I went to the office, and he of course assumed I must work there because it was so early. It was out of opening hours. So he said he always wanted to talk to someone who works at the Serpentine to tell me a story. So I said, absolutely, you know, I'm working there. I'm very happy to listen to him. So he told me the story of his daughter, and they went on a walk last summer. And we always build these pavilions. You know, we do public art in the park. This year it's Christo and Liu Fan, but we also invite architects to build a pavilion. This year it's the Mexican architect Frida Escobedo, who built an extraordinary pavilion, which is, I think, a great example. She achieved a great example for this idea of mondialité, because she created a truly international pavilion, a pavilion for the dialogue of all people, very much what Clisson said, you know, a pavilion of tout monde, of an all-world pavilion. At the same time, it's very deeply rooted in her native, you know, it's very, very deeply rooted in her home, you know, context in Mexico City, with the gelosias, with these porous walls which give us a breeze, with the Mexican courtyard. At the same time, it deeply connects it to the local, to London, where it takes place. It connects to the park. She follows the Meridian, which of course comes from the same time as the, you know, Crystal Palace, as the great exhibition in 1851. So she made these very specific London references, these very specific Mexican references, blended them. So it's both local and global, very much as Nicolas Berquin said this afternoon, you know, not either or, but both and. Both and instead of either or, instead of non, non. As in French, one would say et au lieu de ou au lieu de ni. And so, to come back to the taxi driver story, so the driver wanted to tell me the story of his daughter because they went on a walk last summer, and all of a sudden his daughter ran into the pavilion, and actually he had to go and fetch her to continue the walk on a Sunday. And of course, you know, we have no doors in the pavilion. It's really architecture for all, art for all. Everybody is invited. As Tim Berners-Lee would say, you know, this is for everyone. It's a every year, you know, an architect from different parts of the world who is invited to build this pavilion. And so the taxi driver had to get his daughter, and he said, but never ever would I visit a museum. He said, it's the first time ever I visit a museum. And so I said, but why? Why would you not come and see exhibitions? And he said, because it's not for people like me, you know. And I think that was when I understood that, you know, it is not only free admission. That's of course very important. It's very important in an age of exacerbated inequality that we make art accessible for everyone. But at the same time that we make the best possible art and the best possible architecture, you know, accessible for everyone. But in a way, what he was telling me, that's not enough, because there are also mental hurdles, there are mental obstacles. And that's, the pavilion has no doors, goes towards the people, is in the park. You know, his daughter suddenly found herself in this pavilion. And he said the reason he wanted to tell me the story is that now she's basically reading architecture books every day, and he's 100% convinced, you know, that she will become an architect, and he wanted to thank us. So I think it's very important, you know, that we never forget that this should be for everyone.
That's a wonderful story. Is there something else you want to talk about?
Yeah, let me just check, because before I spoke a lot in this conference, so I'm just going to check if there's anything I forgot. Yeah, the Umberto Eco thing we have, no, about the specialist.
I love Umberto Eco.
Yeah, because he said it's very interesting. He says on the eroding of the idea of the expert, Eco noted, and here comes the quote, distrust of the intellectual world has always been a symptom of fascism. So that's what I meant before, right? But maybe we have covered it. Oh, let me look. Yeah, maybe we can add two more things. I think one thing we can add is when earlier on, I speak about Edouard Glissant, we can somehow maybe specify that the reason why Glissant is this extraordinary toolbox, for our time, and why I read him every day. It's a ritual. I wake up every morning and I read 15 minutes of Edouard Glissant. It's of course because of this idea of mondialité, because early on he understood that the homogenizing forces of globalization lead to extinction, to the disappearance of many things, and that we have to save those things. And at the same time, he understood that the counter-reaction to globalization might lead to new forms of nationalism, new forms of isolationism, new forms of racism, which of course has also to be absolutely resisted. And so he said, we need to find something which is called mondialité, something which is a global dialogue, something which embraces a global dialogue, but in a very respectful way of the local, without actually, necessarily imposing things. I think what is very important is that the 20th century was a century of many manifestos. And I think it's very important in the 21st century to listen also. This idea of listening, I think, is very important. And that's something which was very close to the heart of Edouard Glissant. So maybe we can add that when I talk about Glissant. And then when I talk about the artist placement group of Barbara Stevini and John Latham, I just wanted to make this as a kind of maybe slightly stronger statement. And we could maybe add there that, talking about the artist placement group, which is the invention of Barbara Stevini and John Latham and a group of artists in the 1960s, this idea of production of reality, of actually getting artists involved in the political process, the idea that every ministry, every government, every major corporation, every major company, should have an artist in residence, is such a fascinating idea, because it actually means that artists are there when decisions are made, that we don't just put art and artists, in the context of the museum, but that society can benefit from the extraordinary antennas artists, do have. And it's interesting to note that there are many examples of that. So, for example, John Latham himself placed himself in the Scottish government in the 60s, 70s, and he realized that these very big coal heaps, which actually the government wanted to remove at huge cost, should be kept, because they were almost like a memento mori. They became like a, what a memento mori? They became a kind of...
memorial.
Yeah, memorial. They almost became a graveyard of a defunct energy, encouraging us to find more environmental friendly energies than coal already in the 1960s and 70s. And at the same time, a lot of money could be saved, because it would also be like a piece of land art. So that became the Nigra Woman. It's now protected. It's a very big sculpture, of the scale of a mountain, which, he convinced the government not to dismantle it. So this idea, to reactivate this idea for today and bring artists in every corporation, in every government, in every bigger organization, is something I think which is very urgent, and I would like to urge everybody who is listening to this, to bring artists in the mix.
Great. One last question, because it's something that always interests me, which is the relationship between art and technology. And in a lot of respects, we live in a technocracy. I even looked up the etymology of technology one time. Logi is, of course, logic. Tech is the ancient Greek word for art. So, you know, in a society being driven by technology so much, how is technology changing art, and how can art help the rest of society cope with this technological change?
Yeah, so for us at the Serpentine, it's very important to basically put technology very much in the center of our discussions, because Billy Kluver in the 1960s did the experiments in art and technology. It was called EAT, and we believe in new experiments in art and technology, 21st century experiments in art and technology. So we're bringing artists together with engineers. We're bringing artists together, with AI. We're bringing artists together with VR and AR projects. We are bringing artists together, with the world of blockchain. And for Jana Pil, our CEO, and myself, it's very important to actually have a focus on such new experiments in art and technology. So we have with Ben Vickers, a artist who is also our Chief Technology Officer. So we very much, live this idea of an artist placement group. The Serpentine has an artist as the Chief Technology Officer, and together with Ben and our teams, we put very much this bridge between art and technology at the center. We've just had an exhibition of Ian Cheng, which explored this idea of an artwork with a central nervous system. So the gallery was alive, and Bob, the character bag of beliefs invented by Ian, inhabited the gallery for several months. We had just part of our tech season a big exhibition by Sondra Perry, and Sondra insisted a lot on this idea of not only net neutrality, but also this idea actually that everyone can just download the artwork, that in that sense all her work is open source. So her exhibition was really in that sense for everyone. One could either visit it at the exhibition or download it freely on the internet. So this is just an example, one example, it's our digital season. At the same time, we have the collaborations with Acute, where we're working with VR and AR projects. So our Crystal public sculpture, which is the mastaba, the 20-meter high mastaba floating on the Kensington Lake all summer, has also become a virtual reality project, which is about to be launched. And then we're working, of course, with Hito Steyerl on a project on power, the theme of power, and also not only power in relation to society, and it's very connected to what was discussed here, this afternoon in Bellagio, in this gathering of many different disciplines. I mean, it is fascinating that Niklas Berggruen brings people from all these different disciplines together, from politics, from art, also, of course, sociology, philosophy, science. Because I do believe that if we want to address the big topics of the 21st century, it's absolutely essential to go beyond the fear of pooling knowledge and bring all the disciplines together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.